Hey, kia ora, Helen Brums here, coming live from Sun City in Arizona. Hope you're all having a super fantastic, sparkling day. Welcome to podcast number 1118. We are talking about the magic of your story tonight. So, I put a little quiz out there. When I put the link for tonight's recording out there, I had on there, how many of these names do you recognize without Googling them? So we had Ralph Clark, Samuel Pepys, I'm probably going to pronounce some names wrong, Michael Shiner, Howard Carter, Anne Frank, Siegfried Sassoon, Arthur Conan Doyle, Queen Victoria, Elizabeth Sandwith Drinker, James Cook, Abel Tasman, William Bradford, and Leonardo Da Vinci. How many of those names did you recognize? What do they all have in common? Well, I have to tell you, I play around a lot on different things. I look around on different things, and I stumbled across this really cool book. And I was looking through the previews of the book, and I thought, I got to have that book. And it arrived today. It's a little bigger than I thought it was going to be, but I have no problem with it. It's called Remarkable Diaries, the world's greatest diaries, journals, notebooks, and letters. Every one of those people mentioned in the description for tonight's live is in here. And there's people in here I had no clue who they were. Some of them I recognized, like names that I recognized straight away was, of course, Anne Frank, Queen Victoria, Arthur Conan Doyle, James Cook, Abel Tasman, and Leonardo Da Vinci. Those are the only names I knew prior to getting this book. Since then, I have spent the last couple of hours since I finished work going through this book and having a look and going, oh my gosh, I'm just hoping like crazy that somewhere out there are printed versions of some of these diaries, because I know Anne Frank's one is definitely out there. I would love to go and read some of these stories that people have. And this is what the magic of your story is all about. These people, when they wrote the words, okay, so people like Queen Victoria may have written her diaries in that because it would be advice to future monarchs of the British realm on things that she did and why she did them, and advice for future, this worked, this didn't work, do this, do that, blah, 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 type of thing, as a guide to monarchs following her. So she may have written her diary for that purpose. Did you know that Arthur Conan Doyle was actually went whale hunting one time? I was like, wait, what? And that was long before before he wrote the Sherlock Holmes series. He wrote a journal about a whale hunting trip that he went on. Leonardo da Vinci, when he wrote his 6,000 pages of notes, did he know that years later people would be studying them like crazy? And looking at this mind of this man who was so ahead of his time. Howard Carter, he basically wrote every minute of a journey to uncover, if you don't know who he is, I didn't know who he was, but he's the guy that discovered Tutankhamun's tomb, the tomb of Tutankhamun. And he wrote the step-by-step journey. Anne Frank, as most people know, was just a young girl who was a Jewish girl who was hiding in an attic. Did she know that writing her journal during that time, that years later, millions of copies of that book would have been sold, and some schools actually studied that book? Did she have any inkling when she wrote that she would become famous because of the words that she wrote about her time in the attic when her and her family were stuck in the attic during World War II when they were hiding from the Germans? Did she know that? Probably not. Can you see where we're starting to go with this? Ralph Clark, he was one of the first people to in Australia to help settle the country, and he talks about the settling of the nation. William Bradford, he was on the Mayflower, and he talks about that first Thanksgiving and a whole bunch of other stuff, like their journey over from England to Plymouth Rock, interacting with the Indians when they arrived. Did he think his words would be put in, would be immortalized years later, hundreds of years later? Elizabeth Sandwith Drinker, she was a Quaker. Did she know about, she was just writing about her life. Who else is on there? James Cook and Abel Tasman, both were explorers. In New Zealand, we know Abel Tasman as the Dutchman who discovered New Zealand. And we've got there's the Tasman Sea between Australia and New Zealand. There's also James Cook, who did the first circumnavigation of New Zealand and drew a map. He was also an explorer as well. And there's plaques around New Zealand of where he stepped foot. Abel Tasman, if I remember correctly, did not actually step foot on New Zealand. But he was the Dutchman that named it New Zealand because it reminded him of Zeeland, the place back in the Netherlands. It reminded him of that, so he just called it New Zealand. Little known story. Siegfried Sassoon, which one was he? We'll get to him. Michael Shiner, he was an African American guy who was an eyewitness to the Battle of 1812. Very interesting story with what they have in this book about him and his life. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I want to read so much more of his story. There's just so much in there. Have I missed anybody off that list? Oh, Samuel Pepys. I got to tell you about this guy. He's like way back in England in like the 1600s, right? He was just an aristocrat who, young lad who lived life how young aristocrats, lads lived life back then. No holds barred on any of his writing. Very descriptive, very straightforward. And he went on to become one of the political administrators, I think it was. So yeah, very interesting. So you'll notice that I have some little post-it notes up here. So I thought, and this is about the magic of telling the story. Who knew back then when they were all writing their own stories or writing about their stories, their thoughts, their ideas, things that happened to them, writing about, recording their journeys, recording the things that were going on around them. Who knew that years later, people would be reading those things? And it's a way for, if you think about it, this is how we learned what went on all those years ago. What was it like to cross the Mayflower? I don't know. But William Bradford did, and he wrote about it. Why not read his book and find out what it was like to cross the Mayflower, especially if you're a descendant from somebody who was on the Mayflower? You can learn what their life was like on that ship as it came from England to Plymouth. You can learn because of that. And which proves my point of, I keep telling, you never know, your story may have an impact on people 100, 200, 300 years from now if you take the time to record it. So think about that. Anne Frank didn't know that her little diary was going to get published and sell millions and millions of copies, and her story would become so famous. So, but let me go and show you some of these things. This is Leonardo Da Vinci. Between 1478 and 1519, pen and ink on paper, because it tells you. Okay, so it tells you when the stuff was, when the recordings were done, if they were done on pen and paper, what form of modality was used. In this case, it was pen and ink on paper. There was 6,000 pages that he wrote, and he was Italian. And of course, we know him as an artist and a scientist. And this is just, turn this book over. You can see just some of his notes on there, his handwritten notes. And it even said in here, one of the greatest painters of all time, Leonardo da Vinci, who lived from 1452 to 1519, was a multi-talented genius of the Italian Renaissance. He left behind more than 6,000 pages of notes, which he probably made on loose sheets of paper that were later folded together and bound to make notebooks known as codices. These contain his observations, discoveries, and ideas in the vast array of fields ranging from physics, architecture, and engineering to anatomy and botany. And you want to know about the anatomy and botany? Look at this one. These are from his notebooks. How cool is that? And this is from back in the 1600s. And we can still look at these pages today. And I was just like, oh my gosh, this is the magic of your story. We wouldn't have known anything about that had these people not taken time to write. William Bradford, he was a colonist. It's a Pilgrim's Journal. He came to be known as the Pilgrim, set sail in the Mayflower in 1620. 1620, 1620 to 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 16 to found the first long-lasting European colony in North America. One of their leaders, William Bradford, kept a journal describing their escape from persecution in Europe and the formative years of settlement, Plymouth Plantation in what is now Massachusetts. Bradford kept his journal for 21 years, and it's pen and ink on paper. There's 270 pages in 2 volumes, and it's written in English. The first part is a record of the 1620 journey and the struggle to set up the colony. The rest was written in stages as events unfolded. And they even said that in November of 1621, Bradford helped organize a 3-day fest to celebrate the settlers' first harvest and to thank the Native Americans for their help. St. Squanto's advice about which crops to grow ensured that the Pilgrims had enough food to survive. The feast became the first American Thanksgiving, and that's written about it in his journal. How cool is that? I mean, we would not have known that had he not taken the time to write. Hang on, I got to get used to this. And, there's part of his journal there. Isn't that beautiful scripted handwriting and everything else? Isn't that gorgeous? Some of the handwriting, I mean, as a genealogist, when you're going through records and stuff and you look at the original records that have been handwritten and everything else, some of them you actually have to learn. You have to learn how to read, and it's like learning another language, because you have to learn that in some cases what looks like a written F to you is actually an S. So there is those sorts of things as well. Abel Tasman. It is no surprise that the journal of the seafaring captain should be filled with entries noting winds, the weather, the courses set, and the configuration of the sails. These brief, almost terse daily notes were made by Abel Janzoon Tasman, who lived from 1603 to 1659 for the owners of the Dutch East India Company. They had commissioned him to undertake a voyage in search of the legendary southern continent, Terra Australis, the southern land, and to determine whether the west coast of New Guinea was connected to it. So he actually had a purpose for coming down there. And these are just some of the things from his journal. He's got the drawings there. He's got the little terse words up there. He's got the whole journal entry up the top corner there. These are people's stories. They have left these behind for us so that we can learn what happened in history, because history wasn't made up. History was recorded, and it was recorded through people's stories. There's stories from the Spanish flu pandemic back in 1918, and here we are over 100 years later. We've just gone through another type of pandemic, all related to the flu of sorts. So did we learn anything from what took place in 1918? Could we have learned anything from that? We wouldn't have known about it had there not been records for it, had people not written their own journals and diaries and letters and things like that were kept over the years. From 1660 to 1669, pen and ink on paper, 6 manuscripts in English, and this is by Samuel Pepys. From January 1st, 1660 to May 31st, 1669 is both a remarkable record of a turbulent period in English history and a frank self-portrait of unparalleled honesty. Pepys takes us, he became a naval administrator. Pepys takes us on the most intimate secrets of his childless marriage and his sordid infidelities in the same plain manner that he describes encounters with a king or major public events. I'm like, I so want to read this book, read his 6 manuscripts. Typically a fine narrative description of the coronation of Charles II in 1661 ends with Pepys blind drunk waking up the next morning covered in his own vomit. Yeah, I really don't want to read that bit, but that is, this is part of his journal right here. You can see his handwriting and stuff, and it was pretty descriptive when you go through and you read some of what was in there. The truth is, I do indulge myself a little more in pleasure knowing that this is the proper age of my life to do it. That's from his journal entry, one of his journal entries. Elizabeth Sandwith Drinker, she was a Quaker, and she lived and she journaled from 1758 to 1807. Recognize those dates? It was pen and ink on paper, 2,100 pages. She was American. She was born around 1735 and died in 1807, and it is the longest first-hand account of the life of a middle-class woman. So just because you think, well, I'm not rich, I'm not famous, you can still write a journal and leave your story behind. So this is, the life of a middle-class woman in the 18th century North America. The diary starts 2 years before Elizabeth's marriage to Henry, a prosperous Philadelphia merchant, and traces her progress from a young mother to a grandmother, recording details of a family life and the couple's contacts with the wide circle of friends. Elizabeth's gripping report on the American War of Independence paints a vivid picture of life during turbulent times. So this is somebody who lived through the Revolutionary War, and it's her own account of what she witnessed during that time. And she actually has really good handwriting because it's readable. You can actually read that. So it was, because some of the handwriting, when you go to read it, it's like beautiful script writing, but you still have to decipher it. So that's another one. The Voyages of Captain James Cook. He was an explorer, a naval officer from 1728 to 1779. And his pen on ink paper, 2 volumes, went from 1768 to 1779. In fact, I'm going to show you this because this is his first circumnavigation of New Zealand that he mapped out. Let's see if I can, and you can see that drawing right there. Notice halfway down the South Island, there's a little island off there on the east coast. And then if you go down to the bottom of the South Island, there's a piece that's attached to the bottom of the South Island. So that little island about halfway down is actually Banks Peninsula, which is attached to the South Island, but he recorded it as being its own island. And down the bottom there of the South Island, that little piece that juts out, that's Stewart Island. That's actually an island. There is a strait between the southern tip of the South Island and Stewart Island down there. And look, this kangaroos. He talks about kangaroos and butterflies. So that was a really cool map. And us kids, when I was in school, we got to study that map and his navigation, and how could he think of this as an island or not think that there was land in between. It depends at the time of day that he went through that area when he was drawing it and out. But he did a pretty good job of it. So there was his story there. Ralph Clark. He wrote from 1787 to 1792, pen and ink on paper, 312 pages. And it says here about he was a Marine officer. It says, rarely has the birth of a nation been written about firsthand in such an intimate fashion. Ralph Clark, who was born around 1755 to 1794, was a British officer in the Royal Marines who accompanied the first shipment of convicts from Portsmouth, UK, in May of 1787 to their exile on the shores of what would become Australia. His diaries begin 2 months before the sailing and cover more than 5 years, ending in June 1792. They were a deeply personal account of the long voyages out on which Clark was often sick, and then of life in the new British colony. Clark does not seem well educated. His spelling is bad, and his journal is far from official, often dwelling on thoughts of his wife and his 1-year-old son, but it provides a wealth of information about the life of the early penal colony. And, his handwriting, it's not too bad. It's readable. You can read it. So, and it was, there's a mower. Arthur Boyle Smith was a surgeon of the First Fleet. Yeah. He was interested in natural history, and his drawing in his journal depicts an emu. Oh, sorry, it's an emu. Moas look very much like that, but were much taller. And moas were native birds of New Zealand. They were giant versions of emus. Michael Shiner, he was a Navy Yard worker from DC. This guy is interesting. Just reading this little piece in here about his life, you see his writing there. But it's got their diary of a slave, and there is a reason. He was born in 1805 and died in 1880, and from 1813 to 1869, pen and ink on paper, wrote 186 pages. And it said, the diary of Michael Shiner, which the U.S. Library of Congress now holds, is extraordinary in many ways. Covering the years from 1813 to 1869, Shiner described all the major public events that took place in Washington, D.C. First-hand accounts, where he lived. He gave a first-hand account of the War of 1812, that was fought between the US and the UK, and documented the racial tensions, strikes, and riots that he witnessed in the Washington Navy Yard, where he worked. He also shockingly described the abduction of his wife and children by slave dealers who transported them to a slave pen in Alexandria, Virginia. For one of the most remarkable aspects of the diary is that Shiner himself was originally an enslaved man who was later made a free man. And then it goes on about how he was an African American, was born and enslaved in Maryland, Virginia, and was sent to Washington, D.C. to work in around 1812. For most of his life, he worked as a laborer in the Navy Yard paint shop. As an enslaved man, he had no formal education, but he learned to read and write, probably at church Sunday school lessons. This is the only type of school that African Americans were permitted to attend at the time. At some point, Shiner began to keep a journal, which he called his book. He wrote in this, and it just goes on and on about the story about him, about the things that he witnessed, and just gives you a very unique perspective. But again, how did an uneducated, and in one of the things it said, it quotes him as saying, at one point Shiner writes proudly, "I was an eyewitness to all this." Now, how would somebody who was a free man turn around and write 186 pages that later would be used to find out what, to be seen as a first-hand account of what happened in 1812 in DC? Just think about that. What things have you witnessed that your stories could years later come about? Then there's Queen Victoria, and about her, she kept a daily journal that she began in 1832 when she was 13 years old, and carried on with a few breaks until the end of her life. There's 140 volumes. It doesn't say how many pages, but there's manuscripts and typescripts. And she wrote from 1832 to 1836. The text that survived consists of 13 early volumes in Victoria's handwriting, some additional drafts, 111 volumes of transcripts made by her daughter, Princess Beatrice, and some typed, unedited copies made by the historian Lord Esher. Beatrice made her transcriptions because Victoria wanted the diaries to be preserved without passages that might upset members of the royal family, and for the originals to be destroyed. So you've got some that are first-hand account and some that have been edited by the Queen herself because she didn't want to upset people later on. But that's another one that's in here. Arthur Conan Doyle kept a whaling diary. It was 2 volumes, 1880, pen and ink on paper, and he talks about the famous is the creator of the fictional detective Sherlock Holmes. Arthur Conan Doyle, who lived from 1859 to 1930, originally trained as a doctor in his native Edinburgh in 1880. When he was still a young medical student, he was offered the chance to go on a voyage to the Arctic as a ship's surgeon. How cool is that? The SS Hope was a whaling ship, and Conan Doyle kept a journal of his experiences during the 6-month journey. He used the diary to record daily life on board the ship, the Arctic scenery, and the gruesome, dangerous work of the whalers. Who knew? I mean, I knew him as the author and the creator of Sherlock Holmes series, did not have an inkling that he was, 1, a medical doctor, or 2, had been on a whaling ship. But this records, in 1880, he records his 6-month journey. I mean, he's even got pictures in here that he's drawn and everything else. And I'm trying to see if I can, the pictures down the bottom here that he's drawn about things that he's seen, his work. Whoops, this way. Let's go this way. See what happens. There you go. Some of his drawings and things like that. But you get to learn about a whaler's life through the eyes of a surgeon that was on board the ship. He didn't know his books would be around that long. Are you getting the idea now that your story is important? Siegfried Sassoon was a war poet. He was a minor poet and an amateur sportsman, and in his own words, a fox-hunting man. Before he volunteered for the army on the onset of World War I, from 1914 to 1818, from 1914 to 1918, he was sent to the French trenches in 1915 and underwent experiences that transformed his life and his poetry. His war diaries offer a vivid account of an officer who was both a brave soldier and a bold anti-war protester. That makes an interesting perspective when you're in the middle of the war and you're in the trenches. But he was born in 1886 and died in 1967, and kept his diaries for 3 years. But he was a poet. So um, Howard Carter, he's the one that found Tutankhamun's um, tomb, and he wrote detailed journals about the search, the discovery, what they found, complete with pictures and everything that he drew in there. And he did that in October 1922. Archaeologist Howard Carter, who was born in 1874 and died in 1939, began the first of 9 journals covering his excavation in the Valley of the Kings in Luxor, Egypt. And within a few weeks, he made the most iconic discovery in Egyptian archaeology. Anterooms of jumbled treasures led to the untouched burial chamber of Tutankhamun, an 18th dynasty pharaoh who had died in his late teens about 3,000 years earlier. How cool is that? And now we've got these records that we can go back to and have a look. Who knew? Think about these things. From 1942 to 1944, Anne Frank, pen and ink on paper. 2 exercise books, 215 loose sheets written in Dutch, because she was Dutch. A small cloth-bound book chosen as a birthday present by a 13-year-old Jewish girl in German-occupied Amsterdam in 1942 was the starting point for one of the world's most famous diaries. She wouldn't have known that at the time. All she did was just Anne Frank's first entries brim with the excitement of becoming a teenager. But her life was already unraveling as the Nazis intensified their grip on the Jewish population. Within weeks, Anne wrote that her sister had been called up for deportation and that her father planned to take the family into hiding. And then it talks about her time in hiding and everything else. And if you've read the books, you know the story. But who knew as a 13-year-old, when she was writing her journal entries, that years later, these journals would have been printed and gone on to sell millions of copies and been talked about in schools around the world, because it was her first-hand account of what was happening at the time during 1942 to 1944, and about having to hide from the Germans in this attic. Think about these things. Your story may not matter, but it is there's magic in your story. You don't know who it's going to impact. You don't know when it is going to impact someone. But as you have heard, as we've gone through I've gone through all the names I can pronounce. There are a lot of names in here I cannot pronounce. And some I probably still got wrong anyway. But this book here just shows you just a smidgen of the stories that are out there, the journals, the letters, the notebooks. Think about autobiographies that have been written by the people who lived those experiences. You've got published autobiographies all over. Yes, there are biographies. Now, biographies are written by somebody else about somebody. Autobiographies are written about the person who authored the book, just in case you needed a refresher on that one. So think about all the autobiographies that are out there where people have written their own first-hand accounts about things that they've experienced, and we get to learn from them. I mean, Anne Frank, a 13-year-old girl in Amsterdam in 1942. Who would have thought her books would have gone on to be known by millions? And then you've got Samuel Pepys. Who would have thought a young man from the 1600s who just wrote about his everyday life in a matter-of-fact fashion, and his journals years later would have impact on people. These are stories, people like William Bradford, who came over on the Mayflower and has experiences on that sailing, has experience of colonizing, their first colonization and everything else, their first Thanksgiving. You have first-hand accounts of those events. We know that they took place. How do we know? Because people left behind notebooks, journals, diaries, letters, and they've been discovered, and we've been able to put the pieces together. Somebody had to record what was happening in history, and these people did, and we can benefit from them today. One thing I love about when I'm doing research for genealogy is when I find letters that have been written by ancestors for whatever family I'm researching at the time. Now they have a first-hand account from their ancestor what it was like to live in that particular time period. It may not be much. It could just be, we went out and we plowed, 5 acres today, or whatever it was. We plowed this many acres today, and then they come in the next day when we planted all this corn, or we planted these crops, and now we're looking forward to the harvest, hoping the winter's going to be kind to us and not destroy anything, or or that spring is going to come well and not turn back into winter. You're living through their fears and everything else. So there is magic in your story. There is magic in everybody's story. Everybody has a story to tell. It may not impact anybody this lifetime. It could be 300, 400 years down the road. Look at when some of these things were written. Some of these scripts that date back to, one of the earliest ones of these, the age of the pharaohs, letters from imperial Rome, troubles in China, before 1500. That's what it says here in the thing. Chapter 1 is before 1500. So you've got stories that go back centuries that we can learn from today, what life was like. Those ones where you've got the views of the American Revolution, Revolution War, you've got the Battle of 1812, you've got first-hand accounts of those. We wouldn't have known what happened during that time had we not had the first-hand accounts. Yes, we would have the military records, but we wouldn't have people's first-hand experiences of what from their perspective. Everybody experiences things in different ways. You can go through the exact same, for example, people going and watching a movie. Everybody's watching the exact same movie. Everybody comes out with different opinions. Something in that movie touched somebody in some way differently than it did the person sitting next to them. Some scenes in the movie will stick in people's heads better than others will. So if you get people that come out of a movie theater and you ask them the same questions about what they saw, you will get different perspectives. That's how it is. That's what life is like. That's why it's so good to be able to get be able to write your story about things that you go through and what it was like for you to go through those experiences. Because people down the road years later, you've got your perspective. Did you write a journal or do any sort of journaling during the last 2 years, 2020, 2021, and into 23 years, I guess, 2020, 2021, and this year. So 3 years. Have you been doing any journaling during that time and giving your perspective? Did you end up with COVID? What was that like for you? What was that experience? Did you have a family member who passed from COVID? What was that experience like for you? How difficult was that? Did you have somebody who passed during that time and you couldn't visit them in hospital or at the hospice because of all the protocols that were in place? What was that experience like? Did you have somebody who passed just before or just after the protocols were put in place? Were you on a cruise ship when they stopped cruising? Were you stuck in a foreign country because you couldn't leave? Sorry, my dog's playing with her toy. Were you stuck in a foreign country because you couldn't leave because of all the protocols that were put in place? Travel was, you're not going nowhere. What was it like for you during that time? People are not going to know. All they're going to have is whatever the newspapers report. And I can give you a whole nother story about that, which I'm not going in there. I'm not going to get on my soapbox about that one. But what was your personal experience during that time? This is where the magic of your story comes into play, because you can give future generations your version of what happened. Oops, sorry, Zeffie. I was meant to toss the toy, not the chew. She brings it back. Because people want to know, how did my great-great-great-grandparents survive during the pandemic of 2020? Through those years of COVID. They're not going to know unless you tell them. It's as simple as that. So grab those pens, grab those papers, grab a digital recorder, grab a video camera, grab your phone, start recording your experiences so they are there for those that are following. Because there's going to be a lot of people coming down the track. Yes, I will put that under there now. There are a lot of people that are coming behind you that are going to learn from the experiences you've been through during your lifetime and the challenges that you'll face, because a challenge that you face today may have an impact several generations down the road when they say, oh, hang on, they went through that back in 2021. It's now 25, 30. and we're having a similar situation. How did they cope with that? Oh, they did that. Well, we can't quite do that, but we could do it this way instead. Because times change, things change. The magic is your story. Your story is important. Everybody has a story to tell. Everybody has challenges that they have overcome in their lifetime. How did you overcome your challenges? Let people know, because your story, the magic in your story is that your story is going to help somebody somewhere, somehow, and you may never, ever get to meet that person. You may never, ever hear that your story touched somebody's life. So somebody is waiting to hear your story today. So get out there, get it written, whether it's picking up a digital recorder, picking up your phone, doing a video, whatever it is. Start recording your story, because your story is important. That's it from us for today. We will catch you guys tomorrow at 6 p.m. Pacific time. So have a super fantastic sparkling evening, and we'll catch you guys tomorrow. And go write your story. Hey, konera, or at least start writing your story. Hey, konera.